Are you tired of long combat encounters that drag on and take hours to resolve? Are you sick of players getting distracted at the table, checking their phones, losing interest in the fight? I'm looking at you, Kyle. Are you getting bored from the dull exchanging of blows back and forth every turn? If any of these apply to you, then you need the E.F.F.O.R.T system. Ahoy everyone, I am Nazir and today I'm going to introduce you to the E.F.F.O.R.T system for smoother, faster, more interesting and more dynamic combat encounters in tabletop gaming. I'm going to run through each of these sections in turn to explain how you can use this system to improve combat encounters at your table. This system is primarily geared towards D&D 5th edition, but most of this advice will be universal and applicable to whatever tabletop role-playing game you are running. We start off with E.F.F.O.R.T environment. This is the biggest section and probably the one that you currently spend the most prep time on. This is all about where your combat encounter is going to take place. Whether you're preparing a map before the session or drawing one out mid-session and making it up on the fly, there are 9 things to remember here. Up first is terrain. I'm not going to run through each of these individually, but the Player's Handbook for 5th edition lists 8 different terrain types. In the Dungeon Master's Guide, in the monster lists at the back of the book, it expands on this list with 3 more types of terrain, bringing us to 11 total. Now, this doesn't cover everything, but it can act as a good prompt when you are doing your prep. And as far as encounters go, you'll want to think about the impact the terrain has on the encounter, in terms of weather, the ground, the vegetation. How easy or difficult is that terrain type going to be to traverse? For example, has a rainstorm swept through the area, making the mud difficult to walk through? Or perhaps the ice on the lake is now thick enough in the winter to walk straight across. Even then, perhaps it's slippery. You'll also want to think about the time of year, time of day and the overall light level and temperature, as these can also affect how a battle plays out. Overall, this is definitely something that has a bigger impact on encounters that take place outdoors, but is worth considering wherever your encounter is. The second thing we're going to discuss on environment is the shape and the flow of the map. Think about how much space the monsters and the party have to move around. Are there any narrow passages where creatures are likely to clump up? Are there any bottlenecks? Are there any long open areas with good lines of sight for ranged attacks? Think about not just the shape of the space when it's empty, but how the creatures will fill that space and move around it once the battle starts. The third thing to think about here is obstructions. By obstructions, I mean things which under normal circumstances a creature cannot move or likely see through, such as doors, walls, pillars, columns, trees, boulders, things like that. With doors, remember that they are dynamic objects. They can be opened and closed, used as cover, maybe even broken or locked during combat. Equally, trees can be burned down. Boulders can possibly be pushed, rolled or even thrown. For walls, Game Masters tend to see walls as just simple indestructible lines on a grid, but there can be far more to them than that. Ask yourself, what are they made of? Wood, stone, brick? Something else? Are they wet, dry, slippery, jagged? Are they easy to climb? Are they flammable? Are they strong and sturdy? Might they even crumble if a creature is shoved against them? In terms of cover, just throw in a bunch of objects that make sense in the area of your map. Let the players choose whether or not they want to use them. If there's a fight in a house, for example, put some wooden benches or a table in the room that they could flip over for half cover. If there's a fight in an open, empty field, perhaps there's a fallen log or a stump or some farming equipment lying around. The important thing here is to give the players options. The fourth thing to cover on environment is elevation. Flat maps are boring. Always introduce elevation wherever you can. Players like to take the high ground and they love to push enemies off things. If you've been playing Baldur's Gate 3, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're building a cave or a dungeon of any kind, it is simple to just add in a couple of elevation elements. I'm not saying you need whole multiple levels, in fact that can make things too complicated sometimes for tabletop play. All you need is a balcony or two here, a couple of pits there, a staircase, a ramp, a lookout tower. Just make sure you get some elevation in there somewhere. Even when you're running an encounter on a flat open road, perhaps consider adding in some hills on the side, a drainage ditch or stream at the side of the road, maybe a ledge or cliff nearby. You could even have an upturned wagon abandoned on the side of the road that the players could climb atop of or inside of. Just mix it up a little and give your players some options other than that simple flat plane and the same old 2 dimensions of movement. The fifth item on this list is liquids. Now, why wouldn't I just say water? Well, as you all know, there are plenty of liquids we can have fun with in D&D. Of course, what might make the most sense for many maps is a stream or a river, or maybe even the battle taking place on the coast of an ocean or lake. However, we can also use things like mud, lava, acid, poisonous sludge, oil, apple juice, magical ichor, whatever your imagination can come up with. Some of these liquids may just be a minor inconvenience, making them difficult to cross, and some, like acid or lava, may deal direct damage if you come into contact with them. But there is a whole array of other effects you can introduce here. Perhaps the sludge forces you to make a saving throw, or you'll get stuck in place. Perhaps it also has a chance to poison you, or even put you to sleep. Perhaps some oil on the ground has a chance to make you slip and fall prone. There is a lot of underutilised opportunity with liquids, so try and build them into your maps where it makes sense. Number 6 is gases. Fog or mist, poisonous gas, smoke, magical or toxic fumes. Gases can block visibility, and like liquids they can imbue a whole range of different effects on the players or their opponents. Number 7 on environment is hazards. Many of the things we've already talked about could be considered hazards. Changes in elevation, lava flows, poisonous gas, but hazards also cover traps in the traditional sense. I'm not going to go into detail on trap making in this video, perhaps we'll cover that in the future, but just to give a brief overview, the best types of traps are the ones that A. give a signal to the players before they trigger, so that the players have a chance to react and possibly do something about it. B. can be used against both the players and their opponents, and C. can alter the battlefield in some way. Imagine a goblin rushing up the tower ladder to grab a cauldron of boiling oil. They dashed on their turn to get up there, so they now have the oil ready to drop on the players below. The players now have a whole round to plan a counter strategy. Perhaps they simply all move out from underneath the tower. Perhaps one member of the party tries to climb the ladder and take out the goblin. Perhaps the ranger shoots at the cauldron with a flaming arrow to send the oil onto the other side of the tower where the other goblins are. These kind of traps are a great tool for you as the GM to give your players creative opportunity to turn things around in combat. Next, number 8, we're going to talk about map dynamics. What I mean by map dynamics is a map that features some element that shifts or changes over time. Not every map needs map dynamics, but dynamics can always add a little something extra to any map. A simple example of a map dynamic could be a steep ravine during a rainstorm, where the level of the water in the river is increasing by 5 feet at the end of every round as a flash flood enters the area. You could do something similar with any liquid or gas or weather effect. Another example of a dynamic map effect is a part of the map that moves. Perhaps it's a minecart with a lever, a mechanical crane that can be rotated, a raft floating downstream, or even something magical. Perhaps on your map there's an arcane platform that magically teleports to a different location every round. Next time you're making a map, take a look at it before you run the encounter and ask yourself, what about this map might change over time that could make the combat more interesting? The 9th and last but not least item in this list for environment is set dressing. Now, I'm not talking about decorating your maps to make them look pretty. In fact, you don't even need to draw set dressing visually on your map, you can just describe it. What I mean by set dressing is elements of the map, usually furniture or other miscellaneous objects, which the players can interact with. You, as the GM, don't have to think or plan ahead about what they could be used for. Just throw some random things in to give the players a chance to show off their creativity. Tall amphora, barrels full of alcohol, dusty dry curtains, crates of food. You can draw some of these things on your map if you want, but you can equally just describe them as you set out the scene. You can even go one step further here to encourage more player agency. Let's say the fight has broken out in a ballroom and the rogue has just jumped up on the table and drawn his sword. The rogue asks you, as the GM, is there a chandelier in the room? Now, you'd never thought about that. You never said there was a chandelier, you didn't draw one on, but the best response to this is, sure, why not? There is a chandelier right above your head. The rogue then proceeds to do some kind of acrobatics maneuver to swing around an enemy, land on top of another table and do something awesome. So, Throw in set dressing wherever you can, and be lenient with your headcanon of the map. If you didn't say something explicitly, then it's not set in stone yet. So let your rogue have that chandelier, let the ranger fire at that spilled barrel of gunpowder. Rewarding creativity is super important in D&D. And remember, you are the creative mastermind behind the whole game. If you see an opportunity for the monsters to take advantage of the environment, go for it, as long as it keeps the encounter balanced. Okay, environment done. Let's move on to the first F in the effort system, which is foes. Now, I'm going to assume from the get-go that your foes are balanced appropriately to the party's level. That's not something we're going to cover in this video. What I do want to cover, however, is how to select the types of foes you include and how to run them on the battlefield. The first and most important consideration here is variety. The worst type of enemy, because of how repetitive every round is the solo melee-only monster. All that happens in these kind of fights is that dull exchange of claw, bite from the monster, and the inevitable kick in circle by the party. Now, the solo melee monster as a boss with some action economy buffs can be done right, but most of the time it becomes a boring slog of the same attacks round after round against what is effectively just a bucket of hit points. What you really want to do when you're building your encounter is to choose a mix of foes. Let's break down the three main types. A. Some that are melee focused, that will try and close the distance on the players and get right up in their face. These melee monsters want to physically control the environment by occupying space and restricting players' movement, either through using their own bodies or through using opportunity attacks whenever they get the chance. B. Some ranged focused foes that will keep their distance and use cover to stay out of the player's way. These ranged monsters are either dishing out damage or debuffing the players in some way. C. Some monsters that use magic or other abilities to force a saving throw. Don't only use enemies that target armor class, otherwise your heavily armoured paladin or fighter is going to come out of the battle without a scratch. Make sure you have at least one creature in every fight that has some kind of saving throw based ability. There are also some subtypes of monsters that you can use situationally, such as skirmishers, tanks, controllers and more. Perhaps we'll cover those in more detail in a future video. Our second consideration under F for foes is their strategy. Every monster in every fight will always have some kind of motive that informs their strategy. Now, that motive might be something as simple as survive or eat, but it could also be protect my master, complete the ritual, defend the door. Have a think about each monster's motivation for each encounter and then plan their tactics and actions on their turn in accordance with that motive. Ask yourself, what does this creature want out of this encounter, and how will they try and achieve that? Then take a look at the creature's intelligence or wisdom scores and act accordingly on each turn in line with that motive. Another thing to remember on motive and strategy is that plans can change, and most creatures will have a threshold on the level of risk they're willing to take before they attempt to either flee the battlefield or surrender to the players. For example, a hungry wolf may first attack with the intention of getting an easy meal. But if a fight suddenly becomes too dangerous and it turns against them and the wolf gets injured, it may simply try and run away. Equally, if a goblin is guarding the door to the treasure room and it sees the barbarian rush in and rip 3 of its friends to pieces, that goblin is pretty likely to throw down his sword, hand over the treasury keys and beg for his life. The last point I want to talk about under foes is action economy. If you're unfamiliar with this phrase, it's essentially the balance of actions and options the party has versus those of the creatures they're fighting. For example, if you have 4 heroes, all of whom have movement, an action which may consist of multiple attacks, a bonus action, a reaction, and possibly an ongoing concentration spell or some other effect every single round. That is a lot of stuff that the party are in control of that they can leverage against their enemies. Meanwhile, if you as the GM just have a few skeletons that can each make 1 short sword attack, they are not going to stand a chance. In most encounters, the players will have the action economy advantage over the monsters. To remedy this, either when selecting or homebrewing your own monsters, make sure they have something they can do as a bonus action, that they always remember to take their reaction whenever they get a chance, and for boss monsters, make sure they have some legendary actions and maybe even lair actions. This is all key to leveling the playing field and giving your players a real challenge. We are on to the second F in the effort system, and that is Flavour. You could also call this section description, context, or even immersion, but I did have to make it an F to fit in with the word. Fundamentally, what this is about is trying to make your players feel like they are really there, like they are right there on that battlefield in the fight. In terms of our definition, flavour is specifically stuff that you add in which adds flair, but which has no mechanical effect. By definition, flavour has nothing to do with the rules, and is technically system agnostic. There are two core elements I want to cover under flavour, so let's run through them. Number one is monster presence. You could also call this gravitas. Whether you're using a classic bad guy, a recognisable monster from the monster manual, or a lesser known creature from mythology or folklore, it's your job as the GM to convey the nature and the threat that that creature presents. When first describing a monster, try and avoid mechanical terms like creature size categories or its numerical height or weight. These things should just be implied. Instead, say that it towers over the nearby buildings, or that it brushes aside the trees of the forest like blades of grass. If the creature is expressing an emotion of some kind, try and convey that too. Is it frothing at the mouth with rage, eyes twitching? Is it stern and menacing as it looks down its nose with a stare of pity at the party, as though it's about to put down a sick animal? If the players should be afraid of the monster, make sure you describe it in a way that communicates that level of threat. Perhaps by having the monster cinematically and effortlessly defeat some other foe that the party have fought in the past. For example, as the Tyrannosaurus turns its head in your direction, you see the lifeless remains of an owlbear fall from its bloody jaws. Number 2 under flavour is action descriptions. When a player uses an action, make sure each hit or failed save by the enemy feels impactful for the players, not just like they're whacking away at a blob of hit points. When a monster moves or attacks, describe what's going on. The giant takes the club from where it hung on his belt and swings it downwards with tremendous force towards you. Remember, you aren't just the rules arbiter or the referee, you are also the narrator, the storyteller. But this isn't the sole responsibility of the GM. This is a shared responsibility between you, the GM, and the players. For example, instead of the fighter saying, "I make an attack with my longsword," they may say, "After parrying the last strike with the hilt of my blade, I'm going to rush past the goblins and try and swing upwards to catch the ogre's chin with my sword." The effect is the same, they roll to attack, but some tables really enjoy this kind of back and forth discourse. If you want some tips on how to encourage your players to do this more, wait until we get to the letter R. One thing to be wary of with action descriptions is dragging out combat. Not every single claw attack or firebolt needs a lengthy exposition, so use action descriptions in moderation if you'd like to use them at all. We are now moving on to O in the E.F.F.O.R.T system, which stands for objectives. Out of all of the combat encounters that you've ever played, what percentage of them just had the simple goal of kill the enemy before they kill us? Let me know in the comments below. I'd wager it's close to 80 or 90%. Now, for many tables, that's probably fine, especially if you're running an old school style dungeon crawler where you just move from room to room to room, killing every zombie and skeleton and ghoul that you see. But you're watching this video because you want to do one better than that. You want your combat encounters to be memorable and special, and they can be by focusing on objectives. Let's start once again with a definition, and then we'll break down the main types of combat objectives. An objective is something which the party are trying to achieve within the combat encounter. Within the encounter is the important part here, because a combat objective isn't to collect the treasure once the orcs are dead, or to hand the castle back over to the king once the bandits have been cleared out. We are talking specifically about objectives that can be achieved during the fight, yes, during initiative order, so things that can potentially be resolved in a minute or less in game time. Here are the main types of objectives you can use in your combat encounters. Kill something, the simplest one which we've all seen before. Kill the Lich before he completes his ritual. Kill the Hobgoblin that has the next key we need. You know the drill. Simple, effective, but a little bit boring. Destroy something. A variation on the above, where this time the party need to destroy an object, not a creature. Perhaps they have to smash the pillar that holds up the Dark Lord's fortress, or destroy a Lich's phylactery. Protect someone, or something. This flips the previous objectives on their heads. Here, the monsters aren't really focused on killing the party are just in the way. What they really want to do is kill a VIP, maybe a prince or princess the party are escorting, or to destroy or steal an important item. Perhaps bandits have been hired to burn a deed or contract the party are carrying. Perhaps the party have some kind of ancient artifact that a group of fanatics want to claim as their own. Retrieve something. Continuing the theme of stealing an object, this is where the party is there to grab something. It could be a wizard's lost crystal ball, a noble's stolen family ring, something important that moves the plot forward. Press something. The last one on this list, this usually involves some kind of device or mechanism. Perhaps a lever or button or some other kind of interface needs to be interacted with in order for the party to achieve their objective. Perhaps they need to pull a switch to drop a barricade in front of the city gates, preventing more foes from spilling in. Or perhaps they need to douse a ritual flame which is in the process of summoning a demon. At this point you might be thinking to yourself, well, these just sound like standard RPG archetypal quests. See, that's where things get interesting, because each of these objective types only works when you add in the final secret ingredient, and that is escalation. To make the encounter more interesting, you can add in an escalation of the threat over time until the objective is completed. Let's run through a few examples of what I mean. If the party don't kill all of the cultists who are trying to summon a demon, guess what? The demon appears. There's a device on the battlefield that is constantly pumping out poisonous gas, damaging the party every round until they destroy it. The person they are trying to save is a hostage in a wooden cage that's being slowly lowered into lava, unless they can reach the lever and free them in time. If the party don't take the fire crystal out of the arcane forge within a certain number of rounds, the whole arena explodes, potentially killing or seriously injuring the entire party. The possibilities here are endless, especially when you start to combine different types of encounters and objectives with different escalation and timing mechanisms. And mechanically, these timing and escalation mechanisms are something that's really easy to introduce at the table. You either just have these time-based effects tick down at initiative count 0, so at the end of every initiative round, or have them be triggered by a boss monster's lair or legendary actions. Moving further on in the effort system, we are now on R, which stands for reward. Why do we fight? What do we hope to gain? Why do we play games? And where does our satisfaction and fun come from when we play D&D? This is where reward comes in, and it is so important in these kinds of games. D&D is fundamentally a cooperative experience where players can express their creativity to solve problems and tell a story. These 4 behaviours are the ones we want to reinforce in our games with rewards: teamwork, creativity, problem solving, storytelling. Although it is the first 3 here that are the most important in a battle scenario. When we spot these things in combat, like the cleric supporting their allies with a buffing spell just as an incoming hazard is about to arrive, or the barbarian causing a distraction to set up the perfect sneak attack from the rogue, as the GM, you should lean into it. Encourage the party to try out these innovative tactics. So, when you see this happening, how do you reward your players for working together and using their initiative to overcome the odds? You can do this by granting them inspiration, granting advantage on an attack roll or ability check, or even disadvantage on an enemy's saving throw, or even simply allowing a wild scheme to work, something that might normally fall outside of the rules. This is sometimes called the rule of cool. If you have a party with clear roles, you can also reward smart character builds and battlefield tactics by playing into these roles. For example, let's say you have a tank-like build, say a paladin with 20 AC who positions themselves right in front of the horde of oncoming enemies. Let them take the hits. Almost every zombie or goblin attack against them will probably miss, but it will make that paladin feel powerful, like they are serving their purpose on the battlefield. Equally, if a character has a special ability or feature, give them that chance to shine. If you have a wizard that knows fireball, throw a bunch of low hit point monsters at them that they can annihilate in one go. If the cleric has turn undead, throw some undead their way. Give them a chance to use it. Moving beyond player behaviours, there are also some classic gaming rewards that we need to tap into to make every victory feel satisfying and cathartic, and to keep the players coming back for more. These are progression, leveling up or unlocking new mechanical skills and abilities; loot, which could be gold, magic items, or knowledge; and quest development, unlocking the next stage of an adventure arc. Last one, here we go, we are on to the letter T, and you may have already guessed it by now, it is of course time. It is the one thing we started this video with. Combat in D&D takes time, and it can be slow. Just 1 minute of combat in game time can take over an hour in real time. So, what can we do about this? Quite a lot, actually. Let's get into it. Number 1. Managing initiative. Initiative in 5th edition is super simple, although a lot of new GMs tend to struggle with it. To bust a couple of myths first, you don't need online tools, you don't need some kind of initiative tracker with dry white panels. You just need pen and paper. To keep track of initiative, simply ask your table to roll. While they're doing that, roll for your monsters. Now, if you know what fights are likely to come up, you can roll for initiative before the session even starts to save more time. If you have multiple monsters of the same type, let's say you have 2 ogres and 5 goblins, you only need to roll twice. Once for the ogres, once for the goblins. Group your enemies together, it will make your life easier. Another quick myth to bust here is that some people seem to think initiative grouping like this is a homebrew rule or a rule variant. No, it's not. This is how the game is meant to be played. This is rules as written. And it's stated quite clearly in the player's handbook that identical monsters roll the same initiative. Once everyone has rolled for initiative, grab your pen and call out. Ask for anyone who got above a 20. Then 15 to 20. Then 10 to 15. You get the idea. As you count through, add the players and the monsters into the initiative list as you go, and you'll end up with something like this. That's it. That is all you need to manage initiative. Number 2. Hit point, spell slot and ability tracking. We'll start with hit points, but the principle is the same for spells and abilities as well. Next to your initiative list, just jot down the starting hit points for each monster. Split them out if you have groups of monsters. As a side note, I'd always advise either rolling hit points before the session for your monsters or just using the average hit points on the stat block. Never roll monster hit points mid-game, you are just going to slow things down. Tracking spell slots can be a little tricky, especially when you have multiple spell levels to manage. For this, you can use a simple tally like this. Because spell slots are more difficult to track, if you do struggle with this, try to limit yourself to a maximum of 2 spellcasters to manage per fight until you get more comfortable. Limited use abilities such as Legendary Resistance, which has a certain number of uses per day, can be managed in exactly the same way by adding in a simple table. For abilities that can be used and then recharged, or for legendary actions, some small tokens can help you keep track. For example, if you have a red dragon with fire breath, keep a coin nearby. When it uses its breath, flip the coin over to the tail side. When you start the dragon's turn and roll to see if it gets its recharge ability back, if it does, flip it back over to heads so you know that that breath weapon is ready to be used again. When the dragon uses its breath, flip it back over to tails. For legendary actions, you can use a very similar trick. Grab a number of small items. You can use coins again, pebbles, or even D4s if you have enough of them lying around. I certainly do. Place them on your notepad, and when you use a legendary action, move a number of tokens off your notepad equal to the number that the action used. Then, when the legendary monster's turn comes back round again, move all of the tokens back onto your notepad so you know they're ready to be used again. Last point here for clarity. We are only talking about hit points, spell slots, abilities and features for the monsters that you as the GM are controlling, not those of the player's characters. The players are responsible for tracking their own information. That one is not on you, and there is an essential element of trust there in order for that to work and in order for you to be able to run the game effectively. Number 3, and this might seem like an obvious one, but it has to be said. Know the rules. Now, you don't have to read the Player's Handbook, Monster Manual and the Dungeon Master's Guide front to back before you get behind the GM screen, but you do need to get a good grasp of the basics. What you can't remember off the top of your head, stick on the back of your GM screen or have other quick reference information nearby for when you need it. If you do forget a rule in the middle of a fight, don't panic, it happens to us all from time to time. When it does happen, don't go and try and look up the rule there and then. This is going to take time away from your combat encounter. Instead, go with your gut. Make an instinctual ruling that makes sense in that scenario and move on. Just make a small note to yourself in your notepad to go back and check that rule after the game. Once you've gone and researched what the real rule is after the game, don't feel obliged to go back and retcon that decision. Just make sure you remember that rule for the next time it comes up. Number 4. If you have to do it, it's only fair that they do too. Make sure your players know the rules. They might not need to know everything that you do, but they do need to have a good grip on what they can do on their turn and what each of their spells and abilities can do. If you have a player who's constantly forgetting that they have an extra attack, or that they can rage as a bonus action, or if you have to keep reminding them to spend their key points on things like Flurry of Blows, you need to have a word and make sure they understand how their character works. Number 5. Know your monsters. We've all been there. The party smashed through the skeleton horde and made their way into the Lich's chamber. Everyone is geared up and ready for an epic showdown with this powerful spell-casting Lich that they've been hunting down for the past 10 sessions. And then, when the Lich's turn comes around, you look at that Lich stat block and you just freeze. You have to take 5 minutes just to read through the spell list, let alone work out what spell the Lich is going to cast first. Some monster stat blocks in 5th edition are not user friendly at all, and it's always worth spending a little time before the session to read through each monster you expect to come up in the game to get familiar with what they can do. And for particularly complex monsters, maybe even write down a little plan for them before the session. Something like this. Number 6, the last one here on time-saving strategies, and that is roll dice properly. What? How can you roll dice wrong? Well, let me explain. And this applies to everyone at the table, GM and players included. I know you might want to really show off your latest set of intricately carved runic dice, or your dice that have little duckies inside them, but if you want to speed up combat, avoid the fancy dice with intricate fonts and designs that are hard to read, as this is just going to slow down the game. Stick with high contrast colours with clearly written numbers. If anyone at your table has ever had to question whether a die is showing a 1 or a 7, then they are just bad dice, plain and simple. Also, if you are rolling just straight onto a table, you are definitely going to have that one player, Kyle, whose dice is going to knock the minis over, land in someone's drink, or just roll onto the floor and get lost under the sofa. Invest in some simple dice trays and rule that the roll doesn't count unless it lands in the tray. No, Kyle, that natural 20 that rolled 3 feet under the sofa that nobody else saw does not count. Last point, and I know I'll get some hate for this, limit your use of dice towers, maybe just to special occasions and endgame bosses. Yeah, some of them look really cool, but come on, they take up valuable table real estate, they're noisy, and most importantly, they just take longer to use than regular dice rolling. Maybe that is just a pet peeve of mine, feel free to ignore that last one. At this point you might be thinking, E.F.F.O.R.T, that's it, isn't it? But as promised for sticking around, I'm going to share my bonus rule with you all as well, and it is really simple. It is to have fun and encourage humour. We as game masters put so much work into world building, learning the rules, maybe even building terrain, painting minis, and it can be very easy for us to get frustrated when the players don't quite see things the way we do, or don't experience things in the ways that we expected. But that's fine, it's a natural part of the game. Not that the players are the enemy, but no strategy survives contact with them, that is for certain. Expect chaos, anticipate for things to go off the rails, and remain calm when you have to improvise. You'll have a much more relaxed and stress-free GMing experience if you do. And let's not forget how essential humour is in D&D. We are dealing with some dark subjects, violence, harm, death. You need those spots of humour to cut through the tension sometimes. And no matter how serious a campaign setting you establish, whether it's grim, dark or gritty realism, the players will always find some way to make it funny. Whether that's mispronouncing a fantasy name or ridiculing the big bad guy that you've set up. You've got to roll with it. The way I think of it is like this. The GM sets out to write an epic like the Lord of the Rings, but as soon as the players touch it, it turns into Discworld, and that is definitely not a bad thing. So, that was the effort system. What parts did you agree with? What parts don't you agree with? Let me know in the comments below. If you want some more D&D content, maybe some videos on creating a map for your D&D campaign, check out the cards on screen now. And if you've enjoyed this video, maybe you've learned a thing or two, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more D&D content and advice for Game Masters in the future. I'll be sharing the E.F.F.O.R.T infographic with the D&D community via Reddit, so you can print that out and stick that on the back of your GM screen if you want. All the links will be in the description below. That's all for this one. Cheers guys, and I will see you next time.